The destruction of an economy. What did Trinidad and Tobago really pay for these shutdowns? Look at the image. 7 major industrial shutdowns: ArcelorMittal, Petrotrin, Yara, Nutrien, Atlantic LNG Train 1, Methanex Titan, and Promin MHDL. And behind every closed sign is something much bigger than a building that stopped operating. There are workers, families, contractors, small businesses, foreign exchange, export earnings, government revenue, industrial expertise, communities, and economic opportunities that may never come back. That is the part of the story that Trinidad and Tobago cannot afford to forget. The destruction caused by industrial closures is not measured simply by the number of employees who receive termination letters. It is measured by the economic ecosystem that disappears around them. Petrotrin, more than a refinery. The closure of Petrotrin in 2018 was arguably the most consequential industrial shutdown on the graphic. The refinery was more than a place where crude was processed. It was part of an enormous economic network stretching from the oil fields to point-to-pier, contractors, suppliers, transportation, engineering, maintenance, shipping, and thousands of households. The government's own estimate at the time put Petrotrin's severance costs at more than $1 billion. But severance was only the beginning of the bill. When a major employer disappears, workers spend less. Contractors lose contracts. Suppliers lose customers. Restaurants lose lunchtime customers. Taxi drivers lose passengers. Small businesses lose disposable income. Communities lose purchasing power. And the country loses productive capacity. That is what economic destruction looks like. And years later, the debate over Petrotrin's closure continued to be connected to Trinidad and Tobago's foreign exchange problems, with labor representatives arguing that the shutdown severely damaged foreign exchange and revenue generation. Whether one accepts every claim made by the union movement or not, the fundamental question remains: what did Trinidad and Tobago replace Petrotrin with? That is the question nobody should be afraid to ask. Point Lizas, the industrial heart under pressure. Then look at Point Lizas. This wasn't simply a collection of individual companies. Point Lizas became one of the pillars of Trinidad and Tobago's industrial economy, housing roughly 100 companies across petrochemicals, chemicals, oil and gas, power generation, and related industries. When major plants close or are idled, the consequences compound. One company buys from another. Another provides maintenance. Another transports the product. Another provides security. Another supplies equipment. Another exports the finished product. That is an industrial ecosystem. When one major component disappears, everybody feels the vibration. And when several disappear, the vibration becomes an earthquake. The lost exports. This is perhaps the most important part of the conversation. Trinidad and Tobago does not merely need jobs. We need jobs that produce things the world is willing to buy: ammonia, methanol, urea, steel, refined petroleum products, petrochemicals. These industries generate foreign exchange. So when production disappears, the country can lose much more than payroll. It can lose export earnings and foreign exchange generation. The country's own 2020 review of the economy reported that ammonia production fell and specifically attributed part of the decline to plant closures and downtime. Ministry of Finance Tobago. Yara's closure alone removed an ammonia plant with approximately 270,000 tons of annual production capacity. Yara also cited the plant's lower energy efficiency, falling ammonia prices, and its inability to reach an agreement with NGC that would sustain operations. Yara. Think about what that means. A country takes natural resources from beneath its soil and seabed, converts them into internationally traded products, and then watches productive capacity disappear. That is not merely an industrial problem. It is a national economic problem. The jobs are only the first casualty. The graphic says, thousands of jobs lost. But WZYE-TV says we should go further. Ask, how many indirect jobs disappeared? How many electricians, welders, mechanics, truck drivers, security officers, contractors, engineers, and small suppliers? How many businesses depended upon workers spending their salaries? That is the multiplier effect, and it is why a factory closure can damage an entire community. When ArcelorMittal and Petrotrin closed in 2016, Together, they terminated nearly 1,000 employees, according to reporting on the Point Leases fallout. Those weren't simply 1,000 individual employment statistics. Those were 1,000 households whose economic circumstances were affected, and behind those households were businesses that depended upon their spending. The tragedy is not just what closed. Here is where the political debate needs to become much more sophisticated. The tragedy isn't simply that plants closed. The tragedy is that Trinidad and Tobago has struggled to replace the productive capacity that was lost. Closing an obsolete or uneconomic plant can sometimes be justified, but closing productive capacity without creating new productive capacity creates a dangerous economic vacuum. You cannot build a sustainable future by continually asking, what can we shut down? The question must be, what are we building next? Where are the new industries? Where are the new export platforms? Where are the new manufacturing opportunities? Where are the new high-paying industrial jobs? Where is the diversification? Where is the replacement foreign exchange? Where is the next generation of Point Leases? And this is why the image matters. The graphic's most powerful words are not even the names of the companies. They are at the bottom. Jobs lost. Industries weakened. Opportunities vanished. That is the real story. Because economic destruction doesn't always arrive with an explosion. Sometimes it arrives quietly. A gate closes. A plant stops producing. A worker gets a termination letter. A contractor loses a contract. A supplier loses an order. A young person leaves the community looking for work. A family cuts its spending. A business closes. And another piece of the industrial economy disappears. Who pays? And ultimately, who pays for all of this? Trinidad and Tobago pays. The worker pays. The contractor pays. The small businessman pays. The taxpayer pays. The community pays. And future generations pay. Because when productive industrial assets disappear, rebuilding them isn't as simple as flipping a switch. You lose trained people. You lose industrial relationships. You lose markets. You lose expertise. You lose investor confidence. And you lose time. The WZYE-TV bottom line. Global commodity prices mattered. International competition mattered. Plant efficiency mattered. Corporate decisions mattered. COVID-19 mattered. But that does not eliminate the government's responsibility for the economic environment in which these industries operate. Government controls or influences critical pieces of the equation: energy policy, natural gas policy, state-owned energy companies, infrastructure, taxation, regulation, and industrial strategy. And therefore the political question is legitimate. After so much industrial capacity disappeared, what did the government build to replace it? Because Trinidad and Tobago cannot consume its way into prosperity. We cannot borrow our way into permanent prosperity. And we certainly cannot shut our way into prosperity. We need production. We need exports. We need foreign exchange. We need investment. We need manufacturing. We need energy-intensive industries that can compete globally. And most importantly, we need an economic strategy that creates more productive capacity than it destroys. The image says, the record speaks for itself. WZYE-TV says, so does the economic devastation left behind. 7 shutdowns are not 7 isolated stories. They are 7 chapters in a much larger story about what happens when a country loses industrial capacity and fails to replace it fast enough. Trinidad and Tobago did not merely lose factories. We lost jobs. We lost exports. We lost foreign exchange. We lost economic opportunities. And we lost pieces of the industrial future that our children and grandchildren should have inherited. That is the massive price of industrial destruction. And Trinidad and Tobago deserves an honest accounting of every dollar, every job, every family, and every opportunity that was lost. WZYE-TV. Caribbean News. No filter, no fear.